She knelt beside the boy's body, her hands trembling, holding something dark and alive that she just pulled from inside him. "What have you done?" the man shouted, his voice echoing through the mansion. But then the impossible happened. The boy who had been born deaf, who had never spoken a single word in his 8 years of life, opened his mouth and said, "Dad." In that moment, everyone in the room realized that this poor maid had just done what millions of dollars couldn't do. Stay with me, because what happens next will break your heart and put it back together again. This is a story about the kind of miracle that money can never buy. Welcome to Radiant Story and Tales. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you are watching from. Let me tell you a story that will touch your heart today. It's about a woman named Elena, a boy named Oliver, and a miracle that money couldn't buy. In the heart of London, there stood a mansion so grand that people would stop just to stare at it. The walls were white as snow, the gates were made of gold-painted iron, and inside, everything sparkled like a palace. This was the home of Richard Harrison, one of the richest men in all of England. He owned businesses across the world. His name appeared in newspapers. Politicians called him for advice. But despite all his wealth, Richard's heart carried a pain that no amount of money could heal. His son, Oliver, was 8 years old. The boy had been born without the gift of hearing. He had never heard his father's voice. He had never heard the sound of birds singing in the morning or the rain tapping against the window. Oliver lived in a world of complete silence, and it broke his father's heart every single day. Richard had tried everything. He flew to America, to Germany, to Japan, paying the best doctors in the world. They ran tests. They tried treatments. They made promises. But each time, Richard came home with the same result. Nothing changed. Oliver remained deaf, locked away in his silent world. The mansion was big, but it felt empty. The servants moved quietly from room to room, careful not to make noise, even though the boy couldn't hear them anyway. They said Mr. Harrison preferred it that way. Silence had become the language of the house. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a kind that felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on everyone's chest. Oliver spent most of his time alone. He would sit by the tall windows, watching the trees move in the wind, imagining what sound they might make. Sometimes he pressed a small hand against the glass, as if trying to feel the world outside. Other children ran and played in the park across the street, but Oliver never joined them. He knew he was different. He could see it in the way people looked at him, with pity in their eyes, as if he were broken. Most of the staff barely spoke to him. Some felt sorry for him. Others were afraid, as if his condition might somehow be catching. They would smile awkwardly and walk away quickly. But one person looked at him differently. Her name was Elena. Elena was new to the household. She was a young woman in her late 20s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She had come from a small town in the countryside, looking for work to help pay for her mother's medical bills. Life had not been easy for Elena. She knew what it felt like to struggle, to worry, to lose someone you love. Years ago, Elena had a younger brother named Thomas. He was only 6 years old when a terrible illness took away his hearing. Their family was poor. They couldn't afford the doctors or the treatments. Elena remembered watching her mother cry, helpless and afraid. She remembered holding Thomas's hand, wishing she could do something, anything, to help him hear again. But she couldn't. And 2 years later, Thomas passed away, never hearing his sister's voice tell him how much she loved him. That pain never left Elena. It lived inside her heart like a scar that wouldn't fade. And when she first saw Oliver sitting alone on the staircase, arranging his toy cars in a perfect line, something inside her stirred. She saw Thomas in him, the same loneliness, the same silence. From that day forward, Elena made a quiet promise to herself. She would not ignore this child. She would not look away. At first, she did small things. She left little notes with drawings beside his toys. She folded paper birds and placed them where he would find them. She didn't expect anything in return. She just wanted him to know someone cared. And slowly, something began to change. One morning, she found the paper bird sitting among his toy cars. Another day, She saw him wave at her reflection in the window. Then one afternoon, when she accidentally dropped a cup, Oliver laughed. It was a silent laugh, but his whole face lit up with joy. It was the first time anyone in that house had seen him smile. Day by day, Elena and Oliver formed a quiet bond. She learned simple sign language and taught him new signs. He showed her his drawings. She showed him how to make shapes with his hands. They didn't need words. They understood each other in a way that went deeper than sound. But not everyone was happy about it. One evening, the head butler pulled Elena aside in the hallway. His face was stern. "You need to keep your distance from the boy," he said quietly. "Mr. Harrison doesn't like the staff getting too close." Elena looked up, surprised. "But he seems happier now," she said softly. "That's not your concern," the butler replied coldly. "You're here to clean and serve, not to play nursemaid." Elena said nothing, but inside, her heart disagreed. She had seen what loneliness could do to a child. She had lived through it with Thomas. She couldn't let it happen again. That night, as the mansion grew dark and quiet, Elena sat in her small room behind the kitchen. She thought about Oliver. She thought about Thomas. And she prayed softly, asking God to show her how to help. The next morning, everything changed. Elena was folding laundry in the hallway when she saw Oliver walking slowly down the stairs. Something was wrong. The boy's face was twisted with discomfort, and he kept touching his right ear, scratching at it, pressing his palm against it as if trying to stop some invisible pain. Her heart tightened with worry. She walked over to him quickly and knelt down to his level. "Are you okay?" She signed gently, her hands moving in the language they had practiced together. Oliver shook his head. His small face looked tired, and there were shadows under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept well. He pointed to his ear and signed back, "Hurts." Elena's stomach dropped. She leaned closer, tilting her head to see. The morning light was streaming through the tall window beside them, and for just a moment, the sunlight hit his ear at the perfect angle. That's when she saw it. Deep inside Oliver's ear, there was something dark, something that shouldn't be there. It looked wet, and it seemed to move slightly, like a shadow that was alive. Elena blinked, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, it was real. There was something inside his ear, and it looked like it had been there for a long time. Her breath caught in her throat. "Let's tell your father," she signed quickly. But Oliver pulled back immediately, his eyes wide with fear. He shook his head hard and signed frantically, "No doctors. Please, no doctors." Elena froze. The terror in his eyes was real. This wasn't just fear. This was trauma. She suddenly understood. Oliver had been taken to so many doctors, poked and prodded and tested so many times, that he was terrified of them now. The hospitals had become a place of pain for him, not healing. "I won't take you to a doctor," Elena said softly, speaking slowly so he could read her lips. "I promise." But that night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she had seen. What if that thing inside his ear was the reason he couldn't hear? What if it had been sitting there all this time and nobody had noticed? All those doctors, all those tests, all that money spent, and they had missed it? The thought made her angry and sad at the same time. The next day, Oliver's pain grew worse. Elena found him in the playroom, sitting on the floor with tears running down his cheeks. He wasn't making a sound, but his body was shaking. He pressed both hands to his ear, his face pale and scared. Elena's heart broke. She couldn't stand by and watch him suffer. Not again. Not like she did with Thomas. She knelt beside him and took his hands gently in hers. "I can help you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I won't hurt you. I promise." Oliver looked at her with wide, frightened eyes, but there was also trust there. He had learned to trust her. Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver pin that she used to fix the buttons on her uniform. Her hands were shaking. She had no medical training. She didn't know what she was doing, but she knew she couldn't do nothing. "Hold very still," she whispered. Oliver nodded, squeezing his eyes shut. Elena took a deep breath and said a quiet prayer. "God, please guide my hand." She moved the pin slowly toward his ear. The light from the window helped her see. The small dark shape was still there, deep inside, glistening in the light. Her hand trembled so badly she almost dropped the pin. Carefully, so carefully, she inserted the tip of the pin into his ear. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. One wrong move, and she could hurt him badly, but she had to try. The pin touched something soft, something that moved. Elena held her breath and gently pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly, something slid out. It fell into her palm, wet and dark and wriggling slightly. It was some kind of insect, black and round, with tiny legs. Elena gasped in horror and disgust. It had been living inside Oliver's ear, blocking everything, feeding off him. She dropped it immediately, her whole body shaking. Oliver's eyes flew open. He grabbed his ear, confused, blinking rapidly. Then he gasped. His mouth opened wide, and a sound came out. A rough, broken sound, but it was real. It was his voice. Elena's entire world stopped. Her hands flew to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. "Oliver," she whispered. And then he spoke. His voice was shaky and quiet, but it was there. Elena. He had said her name. He had heard her, and he had spoken. Elena began to cry. She couldn't stop herself. She pulled him into a hug, sobbing with joy and relief. "You can hear me," she whispered over and over. "You can hear me." But Oliver suddenly pulled back, his hands covering his ears. His face twisted with fear and confusion. The ticking of the clock on the wall was too loud. The sound of the wind outside the window was overwhelming. He had never heard anything before, and now the world was flooding into his ears all at once. "It's okay," Elena said quickly, holding him gently. "It's okay. Those are just sounds. You're hearing for the first time. You're safe." Oliver looked around the room with wide, terrified eyes. He pointed at the curtain fluttering in the breeze. What is that?" His voice cracked. "That's the wind," Elena said, smiling through her tears. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" But before Oliver could answer, the door behind them slammed open. The butler stood there, his face frozen in shock. "What in God's name?" Elena turned quickly. "Please don't shout," she begged. "He can hear now. He can finally hear." But the butler didn't believe her. He took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. Then he shouted at the top of his lungs, "Mr. Harrison, come quickly. Something's happened." Oliver screamed. The loud voice hurt his ears, and he covered them with both hands, whimpering in pain. Elena hugged him close, whispering, It's okay. I'm here." Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, loud and fast. The door burst open again, and there stood Richard Harrison. His face was pale, his suit perfectly pressed as always, but his eyes were wild with panic. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice like thunder. And that's when Oliver, still trembling, still scared, looked up at his father and spoke. "Dad." The single word hung in the air like magic. Richard froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. For years, he had dreamed of this moment. For years, he had prayed to hear his son's voice. And now, here it was, small and shaky, but real. Elena looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "He can hear, sir," she whispered. "He really can." The butler stammered, "Sir." She was touching him. She put something in his ear. But Richard wasn't listening. He was staring at his son, his eyes glistening with tears. "Say it again," he whispered. Oliver's lips trembled. "Dad, don't be angry." Richard's legs almost gave out. He stumbled forward, his hand reaching toward his son. But then his shock turned to fear. What had she done? What if she had hurt him? His voice rose, sharp and loud. "What did you do to my son?" Elena shook her head, terrified. "I didn't hurt him. I swear. There was something in his ear. I took it out." "You had no right." Richard shouted. "You could have killed him." Before Elena could say another word, security guards rushed into the room. "Take her away," Richard ordered coldly. "No." Oliver screamed. It was the loudest word he had ever said. The guards grabbed Elena's arms. She looked back at Oliver, tears pouring down her face. "It's okay," she tried to say. "You're going to be okay." But her voice was drowned out by Oliver's cries as they dragged her away. Elena sat alone in a cold room on the far side of the mansion. Her hands were tied, and 2 guards stood by the door, silent and stern. She could still hear Oliver crying from somewhere in the house, calling her name over and over. Every time she heard his voice, her heart shattered a little more. She closed her eyes and whispered, "God, please let them see I didn't hurt him. Please." Upstairs, the house was in chaos. Richard paced back and forth in the grand living room, his mind spinning out of control. His son had spoken. His son could hear. After 8 years of silence, after millions spent on doctors and treatments, a housemaid had done what no specialist could. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. Yet he had heard it with his own ears. The butler approached him carefully. "Sir, perhaps we should take Oliver to the hospital, just to be safe." Richard nodded sharply. "Yes, call them now. Tell them to send an ambulance immediately." Within minutes, flashing lights filled the long driveway. Paramedics rushed inside and carefully placed Oliver on a stretcher. The boy kept trying to speak, his small voice trembling with fear. "Dad, where's Elena? Elena helped me." But Richard couldn't even look at him. His heart was torn between hope and terror. Was this a miracle, or had that woman done something dangerous to his son? At the hospital, the smell of disinfectant filled the air. Machines beeped softly. Doctors in white coats moved quickly from room to room. Richard stood behind a glass window, watching as they examined Oliver. His hands were shaking, something he hadn't felt in years. He had built empires. He had faced powerful men. But now, watching his son, he felt completely helpless. One of the doctors came out, removing his gloves. He spoke carefully. "Mr. Harrison, we've run preliminary tests. Your son's hearing appears to be restored." Richard blinked. "Appears to be? What does that mean?" The doctor adjusted his glasses nervously. "We're not entirely sure yet. We found signs of irritation in his ear canal and traces of some kind of biological substance. We'll need to run more detailed tests." "Biological substance?" Richard repeated, his chest tightening. "What kind of substance?" The doctor hesitated. "It appears to be insect-related. Some kind of parasite. Perhaps it may have been there for years." Richard turned pale. "Years? You're telling me that all the specialists I paid, all the tests you people ran, and you never found this?" The doctor avoided his eyes. "Sometimes these things are difficult to detect, Mr. Harrison." Richard's voice rose, though he tried to keep it low. "Difficult? I spent millions. Every year, I flew my son to the best hospitals in the world. You scanned him, tested him, examined him, and you're telling me you missed something sitting right inside his ear." The doctor swallowed hard. "Sir, perhaps you should sit down. There's something else you need to see." He opened a folder and placed it on the table in front of Richard. Inside were medical reports, pages and pages of them, all signed and stamped with official seals. Richard began reading, his eyes moving faster with each line. Then he stopped. At the bottom of one page, he saw something that made his blood run cold. "Maintain current diagnosis for continued funding approval. Harrison account active and profitable." Richard read it again. And again. The words didn't change. They meant exactly what he feared. The doctors had been lying. They had kept his son deaf on purpose, to keep the money flowing. He slammed the folder shut, his whole body trembling with rage. "You monsters," he whispered. "You sold my son suffering for profit." The doctor looked down, ashamed. "Sir, I wasn't involved in that side of things. The board handles the financial." "Get out," Richard said coldly. "Get out of my sight." The doctor left quickly, and Richard was alone. He stood there in the empty hallway, his mind reeling. How could he have been so blind? He had trusted them because they wore white coats and had fancy degrees. He had believed their promises because it was easier than facing the truth. At the end of the hall, through a window, he could see Oliver sitting up in a hospital bed. The boy was smiling weakly, a small bandage near his ear. He looked so small, so fragile but alive. And for the first time in his life, he could hear. Richard walked slowly toward the room. When he opened the door, Oliver looked up at him and spoke. "Dad." Richard froze. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. He walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, his hand trembling as he touched his son's face. "You can really hear me?" he whispered. Oliver nodded, smiling. "Where's Elena?" The question hit him like a punch to the chest. Richard looked away, ashamed. "She's not here." "Bring her," Oliver said softly. "She saved me. She's not bad." Richard's throat tightened. He couldn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he stood and turned to the nurse at the door. "Tell the guards to release the woman. Bring her here. Now." Minutes later, the door opened and Elena walked in. Her uniform was wrinkled, her face pale, but she held her head high. When Oliver saw her, his entire face lit up. "Elena!" he cried out. Elena covered her mouth, gasping. "You can still speak," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Oliver nodded, laughing. "You helped me." Richard stood silently, watching them. Something inside him cracked open. All the pride, all the anger, all the fear, it began to melt away. What remained was guilt, deep, painful guilt. He looked at Elena and spoke quietly. "How did you know? How did you even think to look inside his ear?" Elena hesitated. "I saw him touching it every day, sir. He was in pain. I thought maybe there was something small stuck there. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't just stand by and watch." Richard's eyes softened. "And you pulled it out?" She nodded. "I don't know what it was, sir, but it looked like it had been there a very long time." Richard turned back toward the doctor standing in the doorway. His voice was low and filled with anger. "All these years, and none of you checked properly. Not once." The doctor looked defeated. "I'm truly sorry, Mr. Harrison. This should never have happened." Richard exhaled deeply, his eyes wet. He looked back at Elena, standing there quietly, humbly. "You saw what none of them did," he said softly, "because you actually cared." Elena didn't answer. She just lowered her head. "I didn't do it for thanks, sir. I did it because I couldn't let another child suffer." Richard swallowed hard. His voice cracked. "I thought money could fix everything. I was wrong." The morning sun rose slowly over London, but Richard Harrison hadn't slept. He sat in the hospital waiting room, staring at the floor, replaying every mistake he had made. He had spent years building his fortune, and he had believed that fortune could solve anything. But a simple act of kindness from a woman with nothing had proven him wrong. When Elena walked up to him that morning, holding a paper cup of tea, he didn't notice her at first. "You should drink this," she said softly. "You've been awake all night." Richard looked up. His eyes were red, his face exhausted. "You didn't have to do that." Elena sat down beside him. "You didn't have to believe in me, either." They sat in silence for a moment, but it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It was peaceful, almost healing. Then Richard spoke. The doctors admitted it. He said quietly, "They kept him sick on purpose. For money." Elena closed her eyes briefly. "That's evil," she whispered. Richard nodded slowly. "I've spent my whole life building things. Companies. Systems. I thought I was helping people. But now I see that the world I help create only listens when money talks." Elena looked at him. "Then change it," she said. "You have the power to." He turned to her, his eyes filled with something new. Purpose. "You're right. I will." A few hours later, Richard called a press conference in the hospital's main hall. Reporters rushed in, cameras flashing, microphones ready. No one knew why the famous billionaire had suddenly called the media. Richard stood at the podium, his face calm but firm. Elena stood in the back, watching quietly. He began to speak, his voice steady and clear. "For 8 years, I was told my son would never hear. I paid the best doctors. I flew to the best hospitals. I spent millions on treatments and tests. And I believed them." The crowd murmured. Cameras clicked. But 2 days ago, a woman who works in my home did something no expert could do. She gave my son his hearing back. The room went silent. Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. What we discovered afterward is worse than I ever imagined. My son's condition was not natural. It was not fate. It was profit. He was kept deaf so people could keep getting paid. Gasps filled the room. Reporters leaned forward. Richard lifted a folder filled with documents. These are the medical records that prove it. Signed by people who took an oath to heal but chose greed instead. This is what happens when money replaces compassion. He paused, his voice softened now. I was part of that world. I ignored what truly mattered. But starting today, that changes. I am launching a new foundation. Free medical care for every child with hearing problems, no matter where they come from or how much money their family has. The reporters began clapping. Some wiped their eyes. Richard's voice grew tender. And the first person I'm hiring to lead this mission is Elena. Every head turned toward her. She froze, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Richard smiled gently. She taught me what it means to listen, not with money, but with the heart. After the conference, when the crowd had left, Richard found Elena outside on the hospital steps. The air was cool and fresh, and the city buzzed with life around them. Sir, you don't need to give me anything, Elena said quietly. I only did what was right. Richard shook his head. You didn't just help my son. You opened my eyes. You showed me that people matter more than power. She smiled faintly. I'm just glad Oliver's okay. That's all I ever wanted. Richard's face softened. He won't stop asking for you, you know. He keeps saying your name. Elena's smile deepened, tears filling her eyes. He's a brave boy. When they returned to Oliver's room, the boy was sitting up in bed, playing with a small toy. He looked up as they entered and grinned. Elena! Elena ran to him and hugged him gently. I missed you, she whispered. Oliver laughed. You sound happy. That's because I am, Elena said, smiling through her tears. Richard watched them quietly. For the first time in his life, he understood what love looked like when it was pure and real. It wasn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It was about simply staying, simply caring. Days turned into weeks, and the Harrison mansion began to change. The heavy silence that had hung over the house for so long was replaced with something beautiful. Laughter, music, life. Oliver ran to the hallways now, his little feet tapping against the marble floors. He spoke slowly and carefully, but every word was a treasure. He would stop sometimes, just to listen to the sound of the fountain outside, or the birds singing in the garden. Each sound was a gift he had never known before. Elena didn't return as a maid. Richard made her part of the family. She became Oliver's teacher, his friend, his guardian. Every evening, they sat together in the garden. Richard would read letters about the new foundation. Elena would teach Oliver new words. And Oliver would laugh at the sounds he was still discovering. Sometimes Richard would just sit and watch them, these two people who had changed his life forever. In those moments, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real, deep peace. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky orange and pink, Oliver looked up from his drawing and said, Dad, can I say something? Richard smiled warmly. Of course, son. Oliver pointed to Elena. She's my hero. Elena covered her face, trying not to cry. Richard looked at her with a proud smile. She's mine, too. Later that night, after Oliver was asleep, Richard stood by the window of his study. The fountain outside shimmered under the moonlight. It used to remind him of silence, of everything he had lost. But tonight, it sounded different. He could hear the water flowing, steady and alive, and it reminded him that silence was no longer his world. Elena passed by the doorway, carrying a book. You're still awake? She asked. Richard nodded. Just thinking. About what? He smiled gently. About how sometimes the smallest voice can change everything. Elena smiled back. That's true. They stood there together in comfortable silence. The good kind. The kind that needed no words. Then Richard turned to her, his eyes soft and grateful. Thank you, Elena. You didn't just give my son his hearing back. You gave me mine. She lowered her eyes humbly. Sometimes we all just need someone to listen. Richard nodded. and this time I will. Outside, the fountain kept flowing, its sound gentle and full of life. Inside, the house was no longer cold and empty. It was warm. It was alive. It was home. For the first time, the Harrison mansion was not a house of silence, but home filled with the sound of love. Dear friends, sometimes in life, silence doesn't come from our ears. It comes from our hearts. We get so busy chasing success, chasing comfort, that we stop hearing the people who truly need us. Richard had all the money in the world, yet it took a woman with nothing but kindness in her heart to open his eyes and his soul. Elena didn't heal Oliver with science or magic. She did it with love, with attention, with a heart that refused to ignore pain. She didn't just make a boy hear. She taught a father how to listen. And that is the greatest miracle of all. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or forgotten, remember this story. Because somewhere, someone like Elena still exists. Someone who listens when the world stays silent. And sometimes that's all it takes to bring back hope, to bring back life, and to remind us what it truly means to love. If this story touched your heart today, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what lesson did Elena's story teach you today? Your words might inspire someone else to listen with their heart, too. Thank you for being here. Until next time, remember to listen, to care, and to love,